Welcome back, Reg viewers. Welcome back to our Register studio. I haven't been here in a while, so I guess neither have you. You find it very much unchanged, and we're going to have a great conversation today, because today we're talking about agility. Not normally a subject that's used in conjunction with my athletic frame, but I hope to be associated with agility before the next hour is up, helping me to do that today. In the studio, as you can see, I'm here. You know that already. But joining us from Perforce today is Mark Warren. Mark, welcome to the Reg studio.
Thank you very much, Tim. Glad to be here.
And we'll see how that goes. We'll see if you're still glad in an hour's time. Mark, tell me a little bit about Perforce.
Okay, so Perforce is a version management company. It's one thing we really focus on being the best at is version management. And it's a privately held company, been around for about 15 years or so. But it's used by a wide variety of businesses and also different kinds of users, and we'll talk about some of that later on.
We've got some of them coming up, haven't we? And to get it straight, it is pronounced Perforce.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, because I was having trouble with this actually, when we were having this discussion before. I was pronouncing it Perforce, which is not correct. So imagine it as a P sort of apostrophe force, not a P hyphen force. That would be P-force, which is I found out is a male drug.
I was going to say maybe that should be our rap name or something.
Your rap. Mark, see, we've only just started. Mark's already got a rap name. And joining us also from Freeform Dynamics. If Mark is the man who has agility as his middle name, then maybe Dale is Dale Anxiety Vile.
Thanks for that too.
That's okay.
Yeah, see, I worry about things. I want people to get the best out of life. So
It's important for the Reg readers that you care. They know you care.
Absolutely.
Because you can tell by the way the questions come. Well, sometimes. But that's it. Now, this is a subject you've had a lot to do with in the past as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I was a developer in the old days, as some people know. And what's interesting is, and I think one of the main reasons we're here today, actually, is when you look at development and deployment of applications, a lot of the way in which we control and organise ourselves around that whole process has got its roots back in the 80s, probably, sometimes even a bit earlier. And yet, in the meantime, the world and technology has kind of moved on quite a bit. So I guess, for me, the interesting bit of the conversation today is how some of the things that we've kind of been used to doing should really change.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those lessons learned by software developers 25, 30 years ago, they actually can start to apply to the rest of the business as well. And that's what we're starting to find. And
the rest of the business to listen. That's one of the problems, isn't it? Now, before we get going, I have to explain to all of you guys how to use because we're on tiny television, how to use all the little buttons that are above our head. I assume that they're still above our head unless they've changed the interface and not told me. The most important one is the one which you can use to ask questions. Now, when we talk about these sort of topics, always some of you have strong opinions about it. So let's hear about them. If Agile's worked for you, and if Agile has not worked for you. Well, here is a man. Well, two men really. We'll include Dale on this. who can either give you advice or explain themselves, or or talk about any of the things that are on your mind. It's no good afterwards saying they didn't talk about anything I was interested in, especially not in that voice, because we're here, we're available for you for the next hour or so. You can get hold of the slides as a PDF. You can give us your feedback afterwards, but do ask the questions. That's the most important thing. Now, the point of why we're here today is this sums it up. They deliver early, deliver often equals deliver badly. Now, to me, guys, both of you, very quickly, to me, this seems pretty self-explanatory. I would think that that's really very often the case. Deliver early, deliver often means that quality is going to suffer.
Yes, it is. And that's probably not a good place to start this conversation.
It probably isn't. So there you are. Agile doesn't work.
But that's the risk. There's no doubt there's some risk involved. And the theme of the talk today is about anxiety. So anxiety is if I start delivering before I know what I really need or the customer really needs, if I start delivering before the quality's there, then I stand the risk of not actually delivering anything that anybody's going to use. But on the other side, if you deliver early before you've actually got everything done, that gives you a chance to understand, are you delivering the thing that people actually want in the first place? So there's a lot of risk, a lot of potential anxiety, a lot of potential upside by that. Deliver early, iterate, deliver often, and keep retuning the plan depending upon the feedback from the customer.
Its problem is, Dale, though, sometimes stuff just ends up perpetually bad.
Well, I think deliver early quite often translates to cutting corners and shortcutting and And that's all about, you know, trying to do things more quickly using approaches and methods that weren't designed to do things quickly. They were designed to do things in a very structured, methodical, long-winded manner, let's put it that way. So it's all about approach, really. You try and do things quickly using the wrong approach, you run into problems.
But it's not about trying to deliver a 2-year product in 6 months. You know, I'm sure people try to do that, but that will fail. That's a fairly high degree of certainty. What it's about is breaking up the work into deliverable and usable chunks repeatedly over that 2 years, because I can bet at the end of that 2 years it'll be a different product to the one you might have built if you'd gone for the 2-year product.
Do you see a large number of your customers that, when you meet them, who've been doing Agile but doing it and they're really suffering because they're not doing it right?
Yes. But that may work for them. You know, I don't think there's any Agile Police going to come round and say, you're doing that wrong.
Agile Police, that would be terrific. If you want to join the Agile Police, apply to me at the register.
So I think everybody ends up with something that they might say, it's our version of Agile. You know, what I might call pragmatic Agile. And if you look from a long distance, you might say, actually, that looks a bit like waterfall. But if it works for you, you know, and you're improving the process over a period of time, then that's fine. But there's a lot of Agile aspects to the way people are working. I don't suppose anybody, you know, follows every point of the Agile manifesto, you know, exactly to get it.
So I want to get in on the jargon here. So you're not an Agile purist. You're not an Agile or nothing kind of person.
I don't think that makes sense. I've never seen it work anywhere. Yeah. I've been in development teams as well as configuration management roles as well, and I don't think anybody ever really does 100%. And of course, you know, different organisations work in different ways. You know, for one team it might be pair programming, or it might be test-driven development. For another, it might be sprints and scrums and all those other kinds of things. Or maybe it's all of those things. So it depends upon, you know, the people, the technology, the delivery cadence. There's all sorts of elements that will make the right fit for any particular team.
Dale, does the business have to understand all of this? Because, say, for example, Mark went to the business side and just said what he's just said. They'd say, what? Do they really have to understand how this stuff comes about, or do they just have to know that it's coming quicker to an acceptable standard?
Well, it does actually impact the way the business sees things happening, because one of the big things about this kind of Agile approach, whether it's strict Agile or whether it's kind of more of an Agile spirit, is that you end up not trying to define what the world will look like and embark on a long-term exercise based on that 2-year out view, which is almost certainly going to change, which is what they're used to, let's face it. You're saying, well, let's form a view as to where we're heading, and let's firm up on some of the short-term stuff, and then the business guys will see things delivered in a more frequent manner. So they won't necessarily see the big project rolled out and going live. Okay. They'll see elements of it delivered in a sequence that makes sense. So it's a bit more collaborative. So.
Right, now, before I let you actually get started, which I know I'm keeping you from, I just have a really early question here, which I think is fundamental, from Bob the Aussie. And Bob, you know, he might be in Australia. Bob, tell us where you are. Send us another one.
Must be late for them.
It's a reasonable time of day to be sampling this kind of stuff. But so what Bob asks is, are applications that require data integrity, like, sort of booking systems and financial applications, are they less suited to this technology, or is it just the way in which you use the technology?
It's the way in which it's the technology and the processes as well. Yeah. You know, so there are a few scenarios which are quite tricky. You think about data integrity, because you have to have multiple parts of the system all kind of moving together at the same speed, or it might be highly secure, or safety critical systems that you say, actually that's not a great. What's the minimum? If the idea at the end of each sprint every 2 weeks is to have a deliverable product, well, if you're building the wing of a plane that takes 4 weeks, then that's probably not going to.
I'm not getting on that plane.
Exactly. So it's about picking the things that are right. So in that kind of environment, it might be more about validating various parts of the system in an agile way, where other parts are moving at a different speed in parallel.
Right, so that's great, and there's actually there's questions piling it. Thanks, guys. That's good, and you're going to really go into how that works in real life. And actually, I know you've got a couple of real life examples of how that works, aren't you? Great. Before that, I need a bit of context from you here, Dale. So we've got some stuff that you provided to set this up. Where is this relevant, and how does it work?
Yeah, well, a lot of the work we do is, as you know, Tim, is just looking at dependencies. So, I mean, quite often some exec somewhere gets an idea in their head And ultimately, when it all pans out, some poor sod down here has to do something that they didn't have to do last week.
Do, isn't it?
And so what I thought would be useful just to sort of take a top-down view, really. So 40,000 feet level, we do a lot of interviews of senior execs and stuff in terms of what pushes their buttons. What we find is that there are three things that they tell us over and over again. Cost is important. We need to do things more cost effectively. We need to know how much it costs. We also need things to work when we deliver them. So whether that's in IT terms, whether that's resilience, availability, performance, those kind of things are important to them. They don't necessarily think of it in using those words, but it's just, is it there when I need it, and does it work right? But the thing that comes through time and time again, particularly more recently actually with the exec level interviews that we do, is get IT off the critical path, which is basically a way of saying we need stuff delivered more quickly than you guys have done in the past. And that has obvious implications in terms of how you develop stuff, but also how you deploy and control that deployment, because you're necessarily having to move a bit more rapidly, and the old-fashioned ways of doing things aren't necessarily geared to handling that.
We always keep hearing, the two drivers for IT would be, business alignment, so delivering business function. So the big 5-year IT projects, haven't had a good history of doing that. So that's, and the other is, IT is always about cost reduction. Well, no, it's not necessarily. It's about freeing up resources to be put into those new systems, because IT managers actually want to be supportive of the business and deliver what the business is after. And traditional methods haven't always been able to do that. It
must be tempting to go back to the business and say, you know what, you want it cheaper and you want it better. You can't have it faster as well.
Yes.
It's just not possible. I mean, and that's it. The way we do things here, we do it because it makes it, it makes it to a standard at a cost.
Well, I think the point is you can't have everything faster, but you can have some bits before we deliver other bits. So that I think is an important principle as well, that idea of trickling out or phasing delivery. I mean, one of the big things, if you go on to the next slide, one of the other things that comes across quite a lot from when we look at the business context for a lot of this stuff is, everyone goes on, management consultants talk about business transformation, and it's a nice word.
It's
Sales consulting days.
Works very well for that. Yeah.
But actually, when you talk to people who are responsible for P&Ls and balance sheets and actually running the business, they don't want to be constantly transforming because they're not making money while they're transforming. They're making money while they're executing. And so what business people are really interested in is an environment that's really change-friendly. Because the one thing that is a fact of life is whenever you set something up, business process, system, database, whatever, you come back in 3 months' time, something will have changed, which means that that now needs tweaking. And if you have the right kind of environment, the ultimate is have an environment where when those changes happen, you're able to very quickly respond to those changes, make a system amendment, roll something out, and do that safely and risk-free. So that idea of continuous optimization is kind of a management term, I guess, but it's quite important because it has an impact on systems.
Well, I mean, the phrase that came up, when we were sort of planning this was sort of a perpetual beta, which is a slightly more negative way of talking about it.
Yeah.
Nothing's ever quite finished. Nothing's ever quite ready. And a perpetual beta, from people who know of, sort of like looking at sort of web development, stuff like that, you get your app, and then you get your app again sort of a couple of hours later because they found out it crashes everything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but that's quality issue. I think the thing is, from a functionality, delivery, access point of view, all these kind of things, rather than thinking about it as perpetual beta, it's probably better to think about it almost like it's a bit of a living thing, and you wouldn't expect it to ever come to an end.
The beta is a label, is a kind of get out of jail free card for a lot of people. If they can afford to run the business, think about Gmail or something is in beta for 5 years. They're trying to lower expectation on the quality of service. In fact, it was very reliable for a long period of time. Inside an enterprise, you can't get away with that. You've got to have a system that's reliable, because if the system's worth anything, it's there to run the business. So the idea in the past has been we only deliver selected bug fixes on a monthly schedule or whatever. Well, actually now we deliver bug fixes and maybe some small pieces of functionality change or feature change because the customers, the business has been asking for it.
And what happens if you don't keep up? I mean, if you do, you slavishly stick to your schedules and your big chunky projects, well, development goes underground. People sort themselves out. They do little skunkworks projects at departmental level.
That has slipped out. So it will happen anyway. This is the way that you keep.
So you're better to gear yourself up for a continuously changing systems environment in a nutshell.
Okay, so should we go down to 20,000 feet?
20,000 feet.
20,000 feet. I think it's got a bit more complicated at 20,000 feet.
Yeah, I think, we talked about a lot of the techniques and methods we use have their roots in the 80s when you had a target platform and you went through the whole process and you knew exactly what you were aiming at. Today, that's not really the case. I mean, we regular viewers will have seen this slide from us before, which is basically saying, look, you've got different kinds of platforms. You've got dynamic platforms. You've got your traditional stacks, all this private cloud stuff. You've then got hosted platforms and so on. You develop a piece of software today, you're not really going to be 100% certain where it's going to be running in 6 months' time, a year's time, 2 years' time. So that just changes the way you need to think about things. You can't lock stuff to a traditional environment. So that is a big consideration. We're picking that up a little bit later.
Absolutely, but also, you don't deploy the application just to one platform anymore. It used to be really easy. It used to be, OS 390,
well,
MPS,
really
or whatever.
Easy is putting it a bit strong.
It was relatively easy. If you built an application for the mainframe, it just kept running for 30 years. Nobody had to change it, and it was a green screen terminal. That's all you had to worry about. Today, if you deploy an application, you don't know who's going to be consuming it. It could be a PC with a terminal emulator, or it could be a phone, or it could be a tablet, or it could be some other application because it's a web service that's been exposed. So the environment is changing around the application even after you've deployed it. So that's a whole new world of a problem to solve for IT. How do I update my system to support that changing environment around it, or how do I make my system resilient enough to support
Having brought that problem up, you are going to tell us later how agile methods can help to solve that problem.
Oh, yeah, right.
I do think, things that have gone out of fashion now a little bit, SOA, for instance, and we talked about the agile purists. There were a lot of SOA purists around for a while. Forget the letter of the law when it comes to SOA, but basically the spirit of building things in components and with standard interfaces allowing you to move things around so that you don't screw up the integrity of the system when component A moves from here to here and component B stays where it is. That kind of stuff is pretty fundamental, and it goes hand in hand, I think, with this.
Absolutely.
So what I'm getting the feeling is that we're in a post-purist atmosphere here. That this is the environment.
Yeah.
A lot of the questions there's quite a lot of questions coming in. I'm just trying to keep up with them. But a lot of those seem to be along the lines of how do you sort of integrate this with existing processes, and that's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. So as we move down further, we're at 10,000 feet now, Dale. So we're rapidly approaching the ground.
Yeah,
very fast.
Okay, just waiting for my screen to catch up. But yeah. So there's a lot of stuff in terms of end users and business people. We've alluded to some of it already, but one of the big things that's happened, obviously, is just the explosion in smartphones, the slates creeping in. Now, whether or not these are actually being used in anger in the business doesn't really matter. A lot of people are using them around the edges of the business, and it's changing the way they think about things. And so that, from a systems development deployment point of view, obviously creates... It's just a different angle on the previous slide, really.
What does it create, though? What sort of things do we need to do differently because of that?
I'll let you pick up in a sec.
Okay.
But what I will say is that when you have something that's very fast-moving, like the smartphone environment, the slate environment, you've got to think quite a bit about how you keep up with that movement. So it's just another way of looking at this continuous changing kind of environment. What we've got on here is some of the choices that people. The easy way of doing it is say let's run everything in a browser, but we know that that can have issues. Let's build optimized native front ends for everything. Well, that's a big maintenance overhead if you take it to an extreme. Let's build client agnostic front ends that can run locally, but actually doesn't matter whether you run on a smartphone or an Android device. Well, then you run into potentially usability problems. So there's no real right or wrong answer to this.
No, there isn't. I think a couple of things come out of this. One is this broad range of different technology, what have you. But the expectations of the users has changed. So, the cliche was internet time. Things happen very fast in a transactional way, but actually internet time now is I downloaded an app on my phone yesterday. I saw an app I liked, I downloaded it, assuming your broadband is reasonably fast, 5 minutes later you're using it. there may be an update tomorrow. Oh, yeah, I'll take that update. And there might be an update the day after or next week. It's almost like the perpetual beta without actually being called that. But I expect to update the apps on my phone regularly. If they don't update regularly, I'll probably go and look for another app. That's kind of interesting for business IT. It also is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for software vendors and a challenge for embedded applications. Or entrenched applications. So if you think about some very traditional apps that are behind every bank, there are a very small set of banking applications that are often a package from a particular big vendor that every bank runs. Now, they've evolved over 30, 40 years, and they do the job really well, really reliably. But a startup can come along and just do a small part of that functionality really well, but with a HTML5, funky, cloudy front-end thing that people are used to looking at. And they may start to lose business and users just because one small part of their business has started to go, and then another startup comes along. So as a software vendor, you have this challenge as well.
Now, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, as we say in the jargon business, because Saul here's what it's the question is: how does he convince the business to accept an environment where there's incremental changes, when actually they want to see full, complete systems? They like the idea of having the big, full thing developed. That sort of runs rather counter to the premise that we're talking about here.
It does, and it is a big cultural change for a lot of organisations to take. Sometimes it'll come with executive sponsorship.
Yep.
So somebody will say, I've got this cool thing on my iPad, or I've been using Salesforce, and they update every 4 times a year, and I get a new client installed. Why can't we do that? So sometimes the CIO, CEO might push down, but more often than not, it's going to be convincing going up. So you're trying to find a pilot project that says, that project we said is going to take 2 years, we can deliver you a part of that working in 6 months. Would you rather have that? And you start to prove some, hopefully, success, and then you build up the confidence. But it is a big cultural change. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, the one thing I think we need to remember is we're not just talking about big systems development here. When you look at particularly in a larger organisation, when you look at what the average development shop is doing on a day-to-day basis, it's not unusual for the majority of it to be modifications or extensions to existing systems. Yes. These are relatively discrete projects. The number of change requests that are coming in on a daily basis, and all those things have to be managed in a sensible, methodical way, and that's where some of these techniques...
So ideally to have this at the core of what you can do becomes a mechanism to be able to deal with that in an efficient way.
And you start building the tools and processes, and it comes back again to the anxiety theme. People have anxiety about this
and just in case there's any misconception out there, neither of us are purists in this respect, so no one is advocating applying Agile to everything. That just doesn't make sense in most environments.
Yeah. So we get to this point where we're talking about, can the business keep up with what's going on? And this, always we end up in the studio, don't we, Dale, talking about this. How do you present this to the business? How does the business get noticed by IT? And what's again, it turns up here, right at the centre of this.
Yeah. I mean, there are decisions to be made. I mean, what we've got on this chart here is really how it comes home to roost in terms of some specific discussions. I mean, we're hearing this time and time again. People trying to figure out, where does Agile fit? And as we've said, neither of us here believe that it's the answer to everyone's prayer. So but at the same time, it does have some value. So it's a case of figuring out where to use it and to what extent. There's a lot of discussion around languages and frameworks at the moment, particularly with open source and mobile development, and there's lots of things encouraging people to try out new ways of developing software and deploying software, and that's kind of straining some of the traditional ideas, which is that we have a corporate standard, we're going to do it this way with this kind of environment, we have our corporate libraries and so on. So again, there's no right or wrong there, but it's something that needs to be thought about. And
where do you stand on it though?
My own personal view, and where I've seen people be successful with this, is they define certain types of projects and sometimes certain systems or parts of their infrastructure, and they say, there we apply these kind of standards. And if you think in SOA terms, and someone mentioned the very where you've got very data critical applications, those are your crown jewels. You want to make sure that those things are managed in a very consistent manner. So you might have a bunch of corporate standards and there's no compromise. But then if the marketing department comes along and they want a quick and dirty app to support a campaign, it's only going to be around for 6 weeks. Do you really want to apply all that stuff? You don't really.
Develop it any way you can.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you might lever off the services that have been developed by these guys that actually make the information available. But if that's a call going across the network to invoke this thing's bulletproof. it doesn't matter if this thing's not, because if it tries to request something that is not right, that will have picked it up.
You agree with this, Mark?
Yeah,
free to developers?
I think it's free to developers, but also, developers, mentioned earlier on about developers being very creative, and they'll work around, corporate policies or whatever. With the natural evolution of the team, as new people come in, they may have been using Agile before, they may be, graduates or whatever coming in saying, what is this? I have to submit all these change requests to be reviewed before I can make a change. And this kind of anarchy or whatever kicks off. And so you start just the transition of skills into the business. People start working in different ways. Perforce grew through a lot of that. We were brought into large enterprise because of people using us in smaller businesses and then moving up and brought us through. So they start introducing those processes and ideas as Agile. So they might start off as a kind of skunk works, or they're off in a corner, nobody's paying much attention. But before you know it, over 2-3 years, they've grown up, and now actually this is a big team. We'll talk about some of the challenges of that.
Because Jamie here is asking, are Agile methods necessary if you've just got 2 or 3 devs working? And that's just because of the scale of the effort. You're saying yes. I just saw Bob the Aussie, who disappointingly turns out to be a Milton Keynes. I'm sure that's not disappointing. I'm sure Milton Keynes is delighted to have you. And but he's saying as customer behaviour, does that drive the need for Agile? Is it that we're being responsive in that way? So it's 2 questions.
Yeah, I think we talked about this earlier on with the expectation of the customers in the IT. Deliver faster, deliver more often. And also the failures as well. You took 2 years to deliver that. That's not what I asked for. Those failures are out there as well. So it's the end users that are driving this, really.
Yeah, and I think it is about context as well. I mean, if it's a core system driving some kind of back office function, which doesn't really change that much. It's very highly regulated. It's got to be done in a particular way anyway. It's not a big deal. But if you've got the marketing department example, but also, we've been doing some work recently around supply chains. And it's interesting, if one of your big suppliers comes along and says, we need you to do business with us in this way electronically, well, you pretty much got to jump if you're in certain sectors. And that means actually spinning out a little development project quite often to actually respond to that. So, it really does depend on context. So you need the best, you need both approaches, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and at this point we hit the ground on this, so yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting actually when you go and talk to developers in particular about how they feel about the kind of facilities they have in place at the moment. Their first reaction is usually, well, it's fine. We're doing our jobs. We've got what we need. Then you start prompting them with, what about, tell me a bit more about requirements gathering, tell me a little bit more about testing, tell me a little bit more about change management and so on. So, we could do better here, we could do better there. So essentially there's a list of stuff in the middle of this chart that we're looking at here, which are the very frequent weaknesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this also talks to the scope of, the first bullet here is scope, but an application is much more than just a bunch of C# or Java source code. To deliver a product involves a lot of different kinds of assets, different kinds of skills, and different processes. So especially now with these kind of browser-based clients, designers are becoming more important. You've got project managers that have got their lovely Gantt charts and their spreadsheets, whatever. They need to control those. If you're in a regulated industry, you've got a lot of documentation that has to be supplied alongside the application. And all this has to be kept in sync. So you've got lots of different kinds of assets, you've got lots of different kinds of people using lots of different kinds of tools. How do they all collaborate together? Well, we think that the version management tool is the key of that, and we sum this up as version everything as our kind of tagline. And you've got to version everything. If you don't version everything, you've got bits uncontrolled, then you might as well give up. Especially if you're in a regulated industry. But even if you're not, just think about if you could come back to that system in 6 months' time, could you find all of the assets? Could you find the design specs, or could you find the requirements that were gathered at the time and look back at why you did that work?
And I think there's a different dimension to scope as well, which is how much of the development and deployment activity does it actually cover, because it is quite common to find that you have the .NET guys, your Microsoft is doing stuff with one set of tools, your Java developers using something else, maybe some stuff from Oracle or whatever, and then you've got some skunk works going on that's based around Apple, for instance, and iOS, and they're not using anything particularly. I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating to make a point, but the point is that
what you mean, yes. Yeah. But we just said that's kind of all right though, as long as it's.
Well, it's all right from the point of view of trying not to encumber the individual groups.
Yeah.
But at some point, when there are dependencies between a lot of this activity, and that's I think the reality of life is that you might think of this as a little skunk's work and it doesn't matter what it does because it doesn't really impact anything else. Well, the chances are that at some point along the way, a request has been made to get access to this data and maybe integrate with this service on the network. So it's actually how do you manage the dependencies, and that's the real key thing. And it's not to get really anal about it. It's just to be realistic. I mean, if you have a dependency and you don't even know it exists, let alone you haven't even tried to manage it, then it's an accident waiting to happen. I think that's the important thing.
And the dependencies are really important. It's much more about the whole environment than just the application. In fact, we go on to the next slide. We can talk about an example of that with New York Stock Exchange Euronext, who are a Perforce customer. Clearly, they run all the trading desks for the NYSE Euronext region, which is something like 7,000 or 14,000 servers, and the number keeps growing. They're gradually bringing on different trading boards as they grow out. But they've only got 6 people running 14,000 servers, and these servers process trillions of dollars of transactions every day. They have to be up and they have to be running. They also have to be audited, and they have to be very confident about what is running on those servers. And so they use Perforce as the system of record, and they built a lot of automation around Perforce so that as changes are made, they are deployed out to a wide variety of platforms. They've got every flavour of Unix and Windows out there. And they need consistent and high performance because they need to make thousands of releases per year to incorporate bug fixes, environment changes, taxation, laws or whatever, and new features. And a team of 6 people running that on a global scale is a massive, I think there's various stats around the number of servers managed per admin generally has grown hugely, virtualization or whatever it's helped with that.
I don't normally say this, but I hope none of them are watching this now because there's not that many left over if catch up with it later when you're off duty.
Yeah, but they become more and more valuable, because they are, a linchpin. Automation is what makes it possible. There's a lot more information about this. You can go and watch a video by these guys on perforce.com. But it is a really good example of having to manage much more than just the application source.
And so the fundamental difference that version management makes on this is what? Make it clear to me.
That what's being released is what's intended to be released. It's not an accidental, a bit of code fell out or a bit got left behind. But also, when you're doing when you're being audited or have to report, you can say that's what those machines look like, last Wednesday or 3 years ago last Wednesday, and having that kind of traceability of the entire environment, not just the application, because it could be a patch to the operating system or a change of a network configuration changed the behaviour of the application in ways that you couldn't have predicted.
Okay, now, and this is New York Stock Exchange really isn't it wasn't an example I was expecting you to be bringing up when we got into this sort of project, but
Yeah,
it makes the point that everything has to have.
That's the important thing. It's not necessarily an agile example, but it's about managing the entire application is the important thing, and being agile in the way you do deployment. We talk about we mentioned the DevOps word, which sounds like I think every webcast should mention DevOps a few times, or every white paper.
Well, and we can differ on that.
Well, it seems to be de rigueur.
Rewind.
Yeah. But this is a classic agile development operations kind of story, if you like, in the way that they release their applications.
Okay, so now we're going to have a look at how this works absolutely at the ground level. That's sort of where a lot of the reg readers find themselves doing this day by day.
So you kind of pull it back into the software development world, absolutely. And we talked about these small teams that might have started off doing something, agile style or strongly agile in a waterfall world.
Now there is actually a question on this. I'm going to stop you on this right away. So when does actually something? How much agile process do you need from it being agile to actually count as being agile, rather than just doing some agile thing, but still in this sort of waterfall idea?
Again, it'll be whatever suits you. But if a traditional waterfall style, as defined in the 60s, would be you do one thing and then you do another thing and then you do another thing, and there's some kind of gating process to work through. If you're moving away or breaking down those boundaries, then you're starting to work into an agile way. If you have to gather all the requirements and you say, right, we've locked the requirements, then you start going to some design work, then we lock down our design, then you go into coding, we lock down the code, and then we go into testing. That's a waterfall method.
Yeah.
If you're doing that in a really short period of time, you could almost call that a Kanban method. If you did that in 2 weeks, you could say, I've gathered all my requirements, so I've got a backlog, I've got my 3 things in work in progress, I close it all off, I've done my QA by the end of the second week, and I've got a product to be released. If you wanted, you could call that waterfall method if you want, but you've done it in a 2-week sprint.
Tiny waterfall.
Tiny little
like a
waterfalls.
weir method,
Yes. So the words, could get in the way.
Yes.
It's an attitude to say, OK, we've done that 2 weeks, now what are we going to do next? Because the plan I said at the beginning of the 2 weeks may not be relevant anymore. That's the agility that you're bringing in, is that flexibility to change direction and learn from what you've just done.
That's how you know.
You know what you're trying to achieve, you know what direction you're heading in, but you're not necessarily locking down exactly how you're going to get there. And everything is slightly soft, so you can challenge things as you go, based on learnings and changes.
Can old people who've done waterfall all their lives, can they be agile? Can they change?
Yes. I've seen that happen. I'm an old person.
Oh,
I've worked on agile projects, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's, do you agree with this?
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, I think we ran a bit of research with the Register. I think you guys were involved with it, weren't you, a few years ago? And one of the big things that came across then was, it's all very well putting young, talented guys on an agile project, but they don't necessarily have the experience to know that actually what's just been decided in a little agile in a meeting of that team is going to lead to some horrendous consequence that the old timer will know it immediately based on experience. So I think blending teams and having the right mix of teams with experienced people, the gifted youngsters, and so on, as well as different disciplines. I mean, that's one of the benefits of Agile in bringing that stuff to bear on the same problem and objective, but it's also one of the potential problems, and that if you do have weak elements in a team, it can actually lead to...
It is interesting, but it is happening. In a previous life, before Perforce, I did meet, a couple of years ago now, I met a large insurance company in the US where they had a traditional big mainframe insurance processing business, and they had their website. But they were starting a new team up where they're bringing together the best of their Java developers and the best of the mainframe programmers and a really good architect who was leading the culture. We talked about the culture before. And doing agile development on the mainframe. And so that was bringing the best, the old world and the new world together. So there are people out there doing this stuff.
How often does that work, though?
Well, it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But, I think we're in a transition period, which may last for quite a number of years. But
what you're saying is elements of that are going to become more and more relevant.
Absolutely.
At all levels.
Yeah. And it could be around the outside. That mainframe system may still be there, but it's the consumers, the applications, the mobile client or whatever.
And to be fair, the mainframe today is not the same as the mainframe.
No.
It's open standards, run anything you really want. And, IBM, CA have invested huge amounts in terms of bringing youngsters through that actually are familiar with the mainframe architecture, but they're not programming in the same old languages that their fathers and grandfathers were using. They're using modern stuff.
So one of the things, kind of came out of one of the actual previous slide with the tensions business is about having tools and processes that support whatever you're doing and being agnostic to agile versus waterfall and allow you to make that move. And that's where
I think that's the important thing. It's probably worth sort of stressing that at this stage. I mean, a lot of what you're advocating is an agnostic platform which allows you to do version management across different development environments, between development and ops, and different aspects of the whole life cycle of the process from end to end. And that's just sort of getting away from these version control mechanisms that have been very language specific or tool specific in the past.
Right, so that answers about that. That's a whole bunch of questions actually about that we've got all in one. Now tell us, what we've got here, because I don't understand what some of these things are in the middle of the box.
So it is a little bit of an eye test as well, probably in the little window. But the idea being, when we talked about before, small teams starting off some kind of Scrum method. Say they're working on or an Agile method. Say they're using Scrums as they're doing kind of 2-week iterations. They work out a backlog at the beginning of the period. They have a prioritised task list they're going to work through, and at the end of the 2 weeks they've got some code that works, and it's met their definition of done. Now, a common way we see working is to create a Scrum team for each of those features, and a Scrum team is a fully enabled set of people. So it might be 2 coders, a QA person, it might be an ops person these days, and a documenter working together to deliver a workable product, a usable product at the end of the 2 weeks. And you might create a team like that for each feature over and they all come together at the end of 2 weeks. And the idea here is that the bottom row of this chart is a feature-based team. And that works really well when you've got 2 or 3 teams working quite closely together, and they can all deliver, every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. So you bring them all together as a scrum of scrums, and you've got a full product release you can make. Now, not always. Sorry, that doesn't always work. it might be somebody's discovered something they didn't know at the beginning, so some work takes longer, maybe some dependencies didn't work out. So some of those features may slip into the next sprint, the next iteration. The approach that Perforce uses, and this is a diagram, which is what we call our streams model, which makes it really easy to manage those individual task-based teams to work on their own branch, their own stream of change, and manage how those changes get propagated out to a release system. And if if the work isn't completed in a particular sprint, it's really easy to reparent that task to the next sprint. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to kind of pull it all from one place and put it into another to restart the project. It's a very simple operation. Mm-hmm. But by having these simple rules, and these are rules which were very pragmatic, because these were rules that are kind of enforced by the tool, built after 15 years of people not having any process at all and using Perforce. So just watching the best behaviours of people and then starting to give them some guidance. Now, we call this kind of, it's a bit like the rules of the road. You generally drive on the left, you stop when the red light comes up. Just occasionally, you might need to drive through a hedge. So there's an emergency fix. So you have to switch over to your release stream and make a quick fix there, and it doesn't have to go through the whole workflow. But as long as you know that you're doing that, and the tool automates the switching of context. So, put all my unstable development changes to one side, switch me over to what the code is actually running in production, let me fix that, and then I can switch back again. And that's all handled automatically for you. So this is a model that we've found that works with development teams. Both internally, we've used this model, as well as externally as well.
Mm-hmm. And scales?
This is the tricky bit for any kind of agile methodology, I think. So it works really well when you've got one Scrum team, or you've got 2 or 3 close to each other. But as you start scaling up and you've got more and more complicated applications where you need more code, more artwork, more web pages or whatever, and those people may be in different locations. So, this is a scenario we see quite often. This is a globally distributed team where you might have HQ in the US, where you've got most of the development work going on, but there's a team in Europe that might be building the web front end or a web site to go around the application. There might be a QA team in India. Now, each of those teams need to be coordinated and collaborate together, but they have different needs of the system. If you're running the build and QA farm, you do a lot of pulling of source code and building and running tests and putting the test back, but you don't do a lot of check-ins. You don't do a lot of, you don't need a lot of fast check-in to the central server. But the thing that does make all this work is a central versioning service, a collaboration point where everybody can go and say, that is the one source of truth. We can always go back to there. We might work disconnected, somewhere where the network connections aren't great. You might even work completely offline. And we have a technology called Sandbox that allows developers especially to take their task offline, go away, sit in a dark room somewhere or on a train or a plane, do their work, come back and then put it back into the repository when they're ready. But once it's in the repository, then everybody gets access to it instantly. So that's the benefit of having a central versioning service, that you've got a single point of control, single point of vision, and you can let everybody work safely side by side. There shouldn't be a fear in creating a branch to go off and do some work, because you're not sure if you can put that work back again safely, or how hard is it to merge my changes with somebody else's.
Briefly, Dale, is this a realistic? Is this a realistic goal? Does this map to what you're seeing?
Well, the scenarios that have been described are obviously, that's just the real world. So that's the way it happens.
Well, yes.
So I think another way of looking at it is, what would happen by default? Well, people start working outside of the process and disconnected from systems. So this is just a way of keeping
reconnecting them, exactly. Reconnecting with the system. As the question is can the design phase, Tim asked this question, be as thorough in Agile, using Agile methods, as is in Waterfall? Should it be as thorough?
It's kind of interesting, because it could be. You could go away and do prototyping and mock-ups as part of, that may be a sprint task. You're going to spend 2 weeks to go out and explore. Yes. You started with your epic. We need feature X. You're going to break that down into various tasks, let's say A, B, and C, and then for each one of those, go away and do some prototyping, do some sketching, some just even paper charts or post-its on the wall to say what's the screen flow. That's a sprint. That's a task that you have to do to complete the piece of work. Nice. So the other thing is that you're breaking it down into a manageable chunk. I think when we were talking about this before, we talked about business analysts or requirements authors being heroes in the past, trying to capture all the information. Well, if you're only defining the design for the next month or the next 3 months, and you can go back and validate and start building again, the pressure comes off that you can actually have more relevant requirements, because you're going to get feedback very quickly that you were right or you were wrong, and your next set of next phase.
And I think anyone who's been sort of in the front end of development processes will know what it's like when you go out and you do requirements gathering and you talk to people, and you're asking the question, well, run me through how things work, how you do things, and quite often you get how they should be doing things, and so you don't necessarily get a completely accurate view. And then when you come in deploy based on that, all these things start creeping out the woodwork in terms of mismatches. Oh, that's not actually how we didn't talk about it at the time, but
the thing you fixed is not relevant.
And I think the sort of deliberate early and often approach overcomes that, which is just human nature. I mean, this is.
It's very quickly, because I want to get to our examples, because they make a lot of these points. As Johnny's also asking, because you mentioned a QA team, is the role of testing changed by Agile?
It's kind of interesting because you can test. Developers do a lot more testing now. Test-driven design, test-driven development. So you build a test case before you write the code. That's changed a lot, I think. QA being more interested probably in the entire kind of transactional. The whole end-to-end transaction cycle. I think is kind of added value. That's a higher value task for QA. A lot of automation now. Continuous integration is one of those agile methods that we see a lot of, and those integrations will run a test. In fact, if we move on to the next case study, is an interesting one for Salesforce.com. Been with Perforce for a very long time, since they started up. Very small organisation, but they're huge now. They've got hundreds of thousands of customers now. Their transactions, again, are in the billions of dollars every day. Now, when they started using Agile, they started delivering features to the website faster than the rest of the business could keep up, and QA was one of those areas.
One of the things that people have been bringing up.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So they've built a very impressive infrastructure around the versioning engine, so that whenever a check-in is done, they not only do a build, but they also kick off their tests, and they've got something like 90,000 plus automated tests that run against every check-in, and they're having hundreds of check-ins per hour. I mean, it's the staggering numbers involved here. And the development organisation is just moving so fast that the rest of the business couldn't keep up. It wasn't just QA, it was sales and marketing. If we've got new features going onto the Salesforce.com website, who knows about them? How do we tell
about them? Yeah.
So, and because there are so many features, they have so many different Scrum teams. We've got something like 125 Scrum teams running in parallel right now, each one working on a chunk of new functionality that's being rolled out. So what they had to do is they found that they all had to fit into a natural cadence. So they all end their sprints at the end of the month. They all come together, and the whole development organisation, wherever they are, and that's globally distributed as well, to deliver together. And but all the time there's a continuous integration testing running. And then they do a quarterly release to the website, and that's what the sales and marketing team are aligning themselves around. So the marketing team is Agile as well. They call this their adaptive delivery methodology. So it's much more than just software, it's a whole business oriented around that.
That's a big management change for a lot of the people that will be watching this, isn't it? Yeah. Is this a company that was built from the ground up to do this sort of thing?
Absolutely, and a very strong leadership that says this is the way it will be. But they've really reaped the benefit of that, and they can see how they've scaled up. So this is an extreme example, of course. Not everybody is this kind of size or this kind of rate of change. So it's kind of, if they can do it, why can't we? And so we've got plenty of other ones.
I do think the whole thing makes a lot more sense if you get away from thinking about applications as being these monolithic things, and you think about development of components,
features and capabilities,
or features or services, whatever parlance you want to use. And the point being that you don't have to necessarily deploy and roll out and put live everything that you finished. Yes. You can save them up until such a time, as in Salesforce.com, that quarterly release cycle, or 6 monthly, whatever it is now.
Now, this comes again, a lot of people have existing tools and methods and ways of doing things, and what you're really saying to them is, chuck those out, we've got something better for you.
Yes, but it all comes back to the theme of the chat is about the anxiety. I can't scale up to that. My business can't change that. My tools won't let me do that. Quite often, a lot of development organisations are using tools that were built last century. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's quite a long time ago now, actually. But they were built before people started to try and do Agile, and so they're kind of locked into a way of working. Now, I think one of the key changes to be made as you want to move into Agile is to have a flexible and adaptable version management engine at the centre of all of this. Because you can change your development environments, you can change your programming languages around it, but if you can't control what's going on at the centre of it, you're opening yourself up to a lot of risk. Now, the idea of moving from one of these embedded, grey-haired, old, well entrenched version management systems to something more flexible, like Perforce, is quite an anxiety attack in itself. But it needn't be. The chart shows kind of the extreme ends of how we've seen people move from a legacy system into something like Perforce. Either it's just turn off the old system or just leave it running, all new work will go ahead in Perforce. That's a nice clean way of working. It has a lot of advantages, a very fast way of getting going. But you've lost a lot of that valuable history. They're actually good.
It's a little bit year zero, isn't it?
It is. So it is. It might be you're starting up a whole new project, and that's a good way to start. At the other end of the example is we just have to pull everything forward because we've got 30 years of development there, and it's all important.
Yeah.
And everybody starts there and think it really is. Well, really, was a bug fix 25 years ago still going to be relevant, even though that code is actually not being deployed on a new platform or whatever.
Yeah.
So somewhere in the middle is finding the pragmatic approach, we'll come back to that word again, of actually perhaps you're just going to take the latest head revision, or maybe a few back, and over time maybe fill in the useful bits, the bits that are still live and active, and bring that into the repository. And we have tools that some systems are completely automated to allow that to happen. Others are more complicated, it depends on where you're coming from, that will help work with clients to understand what is it they really want, because their first reaction is, we want everything. Yeah, what do you really want?
So you sort of reach back a little way in history, make a sort of an arbitrary cut-off there, but a sensible one. And then when exceptions, when people find, oh, hang on, this doesn't include this, again, reach back into what you had before, and then you can bring that.
I think it was slightly facetious, but in a conversation I had recently with somebody fairly senior at one of the banks, when somebody said, well, we need all of our history. So somebody else from another bank, who happened to be at the same table, said, well, if that's really important to you, print it all off and then see how often they go back to the box.
Yeah, OK. Let's have a look at this in a couple of examples of what you do. Pixar.
Pixar, it's an interesting one, this. So I picked this one out and pulled this in here because, again, it's one of those anxiety things. I've got a lot of stuff, and my applications are huge.
They've got a lot of stuff.
They've got a lot of stuff, especially if it's been around for a while. But Pixar is the extreme end of a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So obviously we know Pixar, the movies. They've been using Perforce since Toy Story 2, I think. So every time they render a frame of a movie, that frame gets stored inside Perforce. Whenever they do artwork, they're designing new characters, the pencil sketches or whatever, that gets versioned inside Perforce as well. And they need that for IP protection. So if somebody comes along and says, I drew Woody 10 years ago, we say, well, no, you didn't. Where's your evidence? We've got the evidence. When they do casting and they do audio recordings of voice talent, they record those recordings. They store those recordings in Perforce to go back to. They also keep all the photographs in the company barbecues and stuff as well. So they use it to version everything. Again, this is a case study. You can come and watch the presentation from our user conference. What's really interesting is that this stuff is huge. When you're looking at a frame, at high definition frame, that's megabytes of data. Their largest single depot is about 70 terabytes. So this is the actual source code, or the actual asset itself. The metadata around it is also big as well, the history of what's gone on. 40 million changes per day across all of their users. Their largest single check-in is nearly a terabyte. Most people will say, I've got source code that's a few hundred K or maybe a megabyte or whatever, that would be quite big. We're talking about a terabyte. Now, that's a big pressure on the network, on the infrastructure, but also on the server itself. Now, they can do this in Perforce very quickly. And they've built automation around Perforce and around their own systems that allow them to provision a new Perforce server. So they have to scale out. They can provision a new Perforce server in something like 90 minutes, rather than days that it used to take to buy some hardware, configure it, install the products. So if you want to talk about extreme agile with Salesforce, talk about extreme size of projects with Pixar, these are just kind of proof points that actually your project isn't that scary. We've helped people do much bigger things.
It must be the scariest job inside Perforce to be the manager for this one. Imagine.
It's also one of the funnest, I think.
Really I've got to say, they get the highs and the lows. If it all goes wrong, you take down a substantial part of popular culture.
Yeah. So some of that, it's probably worth saying that some of that stuff is relevant, though, because when you think about extending the scope of versioning beyond the source code into things like documentation, things like training materials, etc., and you think about multimedia being used more for training, you can quite quickly get up to some quite sizable assets.
Absolutely.
In terms of physical volume.
I mean, this is the way that a lot of applications are heading. Yeah.
And that's a good segue into this case study, actually, with Nvidia, who for graphics cards and motherboards or whatever. They do all their chip designs in various very clever tools, but those chip designs are very big binary files. 15, 20 megabytes is a small one. They're used to dealing with those kind of large binary assets. But what's interesting about Nvidia is they've extended the version management out to the entire business because they see that their documentation of their contracts, the sales contracts and HR employment records, whatever, they're all valuable IP for the business. So their anxiety is about protecting their IP and making sure it's available to all of their users at all the time. So 85% of Nvidia has a Perforce license. So that means it's not just the software and hardware designers, it's the sales and marketing and HR people as well. And they've invested a lot of effort and time in getting the value out of high availability and disaster recovery systems. Now, what's kind of interesting there is if 85% of the business are using the product, that's a lot of non-technical people. And Perforce was built by developers for developers in the way that developers want to work. So we have some really nice user interfaces for programmers. But as somebody in marketing or somebody in HR would say, that's hard. But in fact, a lot of people are already versioning all sorts of non-software assets in Perforce regardless of that. And looking at that, earlier this year we introduced a new product called Commons, which allows for drag and drop versioning. So people that just work with their Windows desktop can just easily drag a file from the versioning system onto their desktop, email it to somebody else, get it back again and drag it back into Perforce. And we handle all the version management. We spot, that's a descendant of this other file that's already there, and we take care of that automation for non-technical people.
One of my questions for Mark before we came on air was we seem to be straying into the land of content management, which we obviously are.
We have. We walk straight in there.
Yes, we're there.
Yeah.
And the obvious question is, well, how do you know whether or not it makes sense to use this kind of solution versus your traditional content management stuff?
Yeah.
And I think the easiest way to think about it is what's the centre of gravity for that versioning. There are a lot of if assets are very systems dependent. A lot of the stuff you talked about, it has its roots in systems. It's tied to certain versions of systems. Then this can make sense. But just to be clear, we're not suggesting that this is the next content management system that's going to manage all of your stuff across the business necessarily. I know you'd like it to be, but I think being realistic, I think you just have to sort of think about what's the centre of gravity for what you're doing.
Yeah, okay, so I would agree with that to some degree, in that that's traditionally where we've come from, because our centre of, our base is in the software development business, and we've kind of organically grown out from there, so people like Nvidia and others versioning everything. But I would say that, with introducing some new products around that versioning platform that are targeting non-technical collaboration, email collaboration, etc., which is, we started on that route with the products this year. Actually, we are. What the important thing for us, though, is, we'll come back and we'll use that P word again, is that we're not a heavyweight content management, heavy workflow oriented. It's the pragmatic sharing and ad hoc.
So you're not going to be going out there after FileNet and Documentum and those kind of guys.
Except at the low end, we see people. We see people with Documentum, etc., kind of bypass it because it's so hard to get their work done. And things like that.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, guys. No, but that's fine. But it's all relevant stuff because it all goes to the questions. We've got hundreds of questions. Well, not hundreds that we haven't answered, but we've got some that we haven't answered. But we're not going to get to, so you're going to have to answer them afterwards.
Okay.
And just on some of the things that Sir Reg Reader say that map to some of these questions. The one I was talking about is this does require that the engineers and the architects are heroically gifted.
Hopefully we're trying to take some of that heroicism out of it, or the need for it, in that if you can scale down the size of the project to manageable chunks, if it's a 2-weekly or a 4-weekly sprint, that's a manageable chunk for a lot of people. It's not about getting all the requirements right for a 2-year project before you start writing a line of code. It's about testing as you go. You're not going to build a ton of code for 3 months and then we're going to go into QA and then find it all breaks. It's about taking the risk out as early as possible, really.
Where does documentation come into this?
It's got to run side by side. It's got to, and that's another issue. If you're not managing your documentation alongside your source code, the two will get out of sync very, very quickly. I've spoken to somebody recently with an energy trading system where they've got version management for their source code, which is very important, but their documentation is unmanaged. Now, because it's a regulated industry, they have to deliver documentation alongside it, and to make sure the two match up. So they're seeing something like Perforce as a way of bringing together
those things. And it's going to, we've dealt with the reliability, but that was one aspect of reliability that I wanted to get in. And this communication thing does bother a lot of people, and it's both communication between teams, also communication between IT and the business. And one final question I want to deal with. If the business doesn't believe that Agile is going to work for them, how do you convince them?
At some point, you can talk about case studies and other people have done this, so it will work for us. But generally, you've got to get your hands dirty and do this. Somebody's going to start a project at some point, and hopefully it'll be a success. You set yourself up with success with good training, have a good scrum master, have mentors come in and work with you, whatever. But you've got to demonstrate some success, otherwise the business will just say,
Wrap us up, Dale, with that same question.
Well, when you go and you talk to business people about their gripes about IT, what's those things that come back? It costs too much, it takes too long, and when it's delivered, it doesn't really do what we asked for. And going back and saying, well, actually, we've got a new approach here that directly addresses pretty much all of those questions. Let me run you through it. And that's the way I would frame Agile in that.
And I think there's a very large government benefits project going on at the moment, which is an Agile project. I heard a presentation recently from somebody about this. And that's the biggest single Agile project going on in the world at the moment. It's a £2 billion project for the universal benefit system. And that's an Agile project, and they've hit all of their milestones so far. And that was a very scary step for something like the UK government to adopt that kind of methodology. They're getting a lot of support, it has to be said, from the various highest levels. And so far, regardless of the politicking that's been going on in the last couple of weeks, the people actually running the project say they're on track. So we'll see.
Yeah,
even in that environment.
Yes,
even in that environment.
Okay, guys, we've run out of time. Here's your stuff. Here's your further reading. If you look on the screen now, there's some links there. Go and have a look at those if you want some more information. For all of those, thanks for all of your questions. There's tons of questions, so thank you very much. Mark's going to deal with some of them that we couldn't deal with in this, but you can guess what they are. I hope we've touched on most of them. Thanks very much for your attention. Thanks very much, guys, for coming in. I thought that was quite interesting. I was pretty interested in that. My name's been Tim Phillips. I'm from the Register. Goodbye.